Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Let me, first of all, apologize for my voice. I'm a victim of Black History Month. I've given too many talks, and the physical reality of it has overwhelmed me. But let me welcome you to the Bristol Festival of Ideas, which, as you know, is this city's never-ending festival of ideas, conversations, and debates. My name is David Olusoga. I'm a broadcaster and historian. And before we begin, let me ask you to do a bit of housekeeping. If you can, please sign up for the newsletter for the Festival of Ideas, so you can keep in touch with all the many events coming up. Please sign up and follow us by Twitter as well. If you're part of the Twitterati, you can tweet about this event during the event. Please feel free to do so. But if we can ask you to tweet respectfully and not disturb your neighbours, because we all know after 10 months of this presidency how tweets can disturb people. This event is part of Festival of the Future City, which runs from today until the 20th. And it's the largest public debate about the future of cities, which brings together architects, writers, artists, change makers, academics, journalists, students, public economists, futurists, policymakers, roboticists, philosophers, filmmakers, think tanks, charities, social enterprises, city builders, and even politicians. There are brochures about the festival in this building and elsewhere around the city. Please feel free to take one. In a minute, I'll introduce your panel, but let me lay out the issues we're going to discuss, if I can. All of a sudden, it seems, statues and memorials to the past are alive and they are dangerous. How cities deal with the past, with their past, with our pasts, are issues that are both immediate and urgent. This year, as you all know, in Charlottesville, Virginia, a young woman was murdered by white supremacists who had chosen to rally around a statue of General Robert E. Lee. In other American cities, and there have been 30 American cities where Confederate statues have been removed, the construction workers being asked to take part in those removals are wearing masks to disguise their identity. They're wearing stab vests, and some of them are wearing bulletproof vests, because the removal of a statue could get you killed. In one city in Louisiana, the American police, the local police, put snipers on top of buildings around a monument to a general who died in the 1860s. The past is alive and the past is dangerous. Here in Bristol, things have not been so tense, but as you know, just a few hundred meters from where we are today, we have a memorial and we have place names that are at the epicenter of a battle that has really divided people in this city. I've written about the Colston issue, and it's the only issue I can say I've ever written about where I've been stopped in the street and thanked, and stopped in the street and shouted at in this city. The issue of the past, history, memorials, statues, names, are suddenly deeply personal and deeply alive. How did this happen? How did statues and memorials, the street furniture that we often ignore, how did these things become the focus of national dispute and international dispute? And where else is this sort of thing happening around the world? And are other cities doing better than us? Are other cities found answers to these problems? From the Holocaust to slavery, from the Confederacy to colonialism, the past is on the march, and cities are the battlegrounds. To discuss these issues, I'm joined by Professor Tim Cole on my right, who's Professor of Social History and Director of the Brigstow Institute. He's a renowned authority on the Holocaust and representation, and he's author of Images of the Holocaust, Selling the Holocaust, Holocaust City, Traces of the Holocaust, and Holocaust Landscapes. Madge Dresser is visiting professor, on my far left, at the University of the West of England, and she's honorary professor at Bristol University. She's an adopted daughter of Bristol, and more than any other person, it's been Madge who has shone a light for decades on those years in which Bristol was one of the centres of the Atlantic slave trade. She's explored both the history of the slave trade, but also the history of how we forgot about the slave trade in Bristol. Her books include The Exceptional Slavery Obscured, The Social History of the Slave Trade, but she's also co-edited the book Slavery in the British Country House and Women and the City, Bristol, 1373 to 2000, which came out last year. She's a trustee of Journey to Justice and is coordinating Journey to Justice here in Bristol right now. Vanessa Kisuule, to my left, is a writer and a performer and a burlesque artist and a general empress of Blag based in Bristol. She's won 10 slam titles, including the Farrago School's Out Slam Champion, the Bang Said, the Gun Poetry Award, Poetry Rivals, the Next Generation Slam in 2012, Slam Ambassadors 2010. She's a recipient of the Jerwood Micro Award bursary to undertake extensive dance training, and she also received the prestigious Leverhulme Arts Scholarship in 2017, this year, from the Bristol Old Vic. I'll begin with a general question to everybody. Why now? Why have these issues suddenly become alive in the past 2 or 3 years? Madge?
Oh, I was saying not me first. I think there's really seismic changes in our culture and our political structures. And although I'm sure the others will talk about politics, we can all talk about Trump and Brexit, but I think it's a crisis of neo-capitalism, and it's not delivering for a lot of people, so you have a lot of big fissures within society. I also think it's kind of postmodernism come home to roost, no such thing as the absolute truth. We've had a critique of Enlightenment thinking, and it's opened the floodgates for all sorts of spurious interpretations of the past. So I think we're at a very deep juncture in our sort of culture and political structures.
Are you surprised, Tim, that the names of buildings, memorials, the lack of memorials have become the focus for these forces that Madge is talking about?
Not so much, because I think more generally, I think there's always a politics to memory. And so I think what's always striking is that it's often rare for something to be remembered in a kind of official way immediately after an event, that it often takes generations for that memory to come through. I think sometimes that can be a bit of a generational thing. So I think certainly in a post-Holocaust context, I think there's a sense of a children's or a grandchildren's generation asking difficult questions that the parents or the grandparents never asked. But I think often there's a real politics, like Madge says. So I guess if you think about Europe, the big seismic change in Central Eastern Europe was 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's no surprise that you suddenly get Berlin doing things after 1989 because of this seismic change. So I think there is a sense at moments of instability or change or transformation or question asking, then often I think that's a moment where you see actually memorials, memorialization, memory coming to the fore. So it's almost, I think you could almost say when people are, if you look back, when are people talking about memorials, that's probably the time when they're feeling anxious.
Really? That's very interesting. Vanessa, you've lived most of your life in Bristol. You've seen statues, names of concert halls, names of schools that have been issues that have been bubbling up or under the surface, but have not really become as divisive and as controversial as they are today. Are you surprised how Bristol has found itself at war with itself almost about these issues?
It's an interesting thing. I've learned a lot already in the past few minutes from the comments that have already been given. I think, to use sort of the bat that a lot of people use in these conversations, technology cannot be overlooked in terms of how it exacerbates a domino effect. So these conversations are happening much quicker and much more passionately and ardently than they would have done without the internet, without Twitter, without a youth who suddenly have this access to all these ideas and opinions and echoes of their own sentiments back at them in a far more profound way. So I think what's happening now is that people can rally behind an idea or a sense of injustice far more quickly. So these things just bubble up to the surface that much more profoundly and rapidly.
So if the debate about Edward Colston was taking place in the letters page of the local press,
yeah,
it wouldn't be having this effect.
Completely different kettle of fish, I believe. It's interesting to think why now, because I think Bristol, more so than some other cities, would consider itself fairly progressive. Maybe this is sentiment to the fact that I'm a student and I live in a certain area of Bristol, but I would say for the most part it's progressive, fairly lefty, fairly this, fairly that. and yet our conversations around these things, I don't know how much they've been at the forefront up until now, really. So what's caused it now? I think, we're looking at our counterparts across the pond. We're seeing what's happening there, obviously with Black Lives Matter, etc. Again, that's had a profound effect on what's happening here. So yeah, I just think that the echoes and the ripples of all the things that are happening across the world are just having a far quicker and more catalytic effect than they might have done before the internet. Yeah.
Very interesting. Tim, in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe, there has been an enormous shift in the lifetimes of most people in this room, which is the fall of the wall, the end of the Cold War. That was another moment when suddenly statues, memorials that people had grown up with became problematic. Is there anything to learn? Well, first of all, what did happen? And is there anything to learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that's fascinating about a region like Central and Eastern Europe, where you've had rapid political change over the course of the 20th century, which is that in some ways each generation has toppled the statues or renamed the streets of the previous generation. So, Adolf Hitler Platz suddenly is no longer Adolf Hitler Platz.
That's a hard sell.
And it's a hard sell in 1945. And suddenly it becomes Stalin, kind of Platz. And then in post-89, Stalin's gone and it becomes something else, often a kind of retreat back to a 19th century story. And so I think one of the things you do see, and it's really striking, I think, in Eastern Europe, is that in 89, one of the first things that go are the statues, because the statues represent something. So it's a way in which the symbolic value of statues is not surprisingly not missed by individuals. Although I think one thing that's really interesting in that context is that there's also voices against the toppling of statues who say, actually,
in that moment when the walls
that moment, I think what you find is an initial toppling of the most egregious statues in some ways, which is often the statues of, say, Stalin. But then there's a kind of sense of saying, but actually this is part of our history. So is there a sense by toppling the statues that we erase an entire period of our history, which is a period of socialism, communism, Soviet control? And so you get a kind of pushback quite quickly, actually, which is there's already a debate, which is that the initial thing is let's get rid of all the statues. And then there's a pullback which says, actually, maybe we should keep some of these statues because this is who we are. Even if we don't necessarily want that to be who we are, this is who we are. And so I think one thing that strikes me is that in 89, statues go, but actually already there's voices that are saying, whoa, are we destroying, are we erasing our past?
And there are echoes of that in the conversations we're having at the moment.
Absolutely.
About, is the removal of memorials and statues a form of erasure of history? And we can hear exactly those two sides of that.
Yeah, no, and I think to me, I think that's the conversations we're having at the moment, I think, are ones that you could look back and see happening in all of these moments of change, that there's two voices at any of those moments, I think.
But one of the problems statues has, it seems to me, Madge, is that they are so eminently toppleable. They're almost an invitation to, it is the greatest street theatre, toppling a statue. There's no surprise at all that one of the first things the Americans did when they entered Baghdad at the end of the last Gulf War was their Black Op team, who had specifically brought heavy equipment up to topple statues of Saddam Hussein. Did that, and they waited till CNN were in position to film it. They are almost inviting trouble, aren't they?
Well, yes, but it isn't just the official bodies that can do it. And I've told this story before, but in 1999, when we had the first big exhibition on slavery in Bristol at the museum, we had some consultation exercises, and I had unearthed this 1920s vicar who had said in Bristol that Colston was involved in the Royal African Company, and I shared this at the Malcolm X Center and documented it with my own research. And the next day, in red paint, was "F off slave trader" across the statue, and by igniting this huge controversy, which has just rumbled on and on and on, because it becomes, I suppose, a physical manifestation of somewhere where you can have a debate in a public area. It's a place where there's a spatial statement that often can lie moribund for ages. I mean, I often think of the name of the pub Saracen's Head, whoever gave that a thought before the rise of militant Islam and the evocation of the Crusades? That we had, you know, a history in Bristol and elsewhere where the Crusades were, meant something, and we're getting that suddenly becoming quite interesting. And we have statues that become much more relevant all of a sudden as our present preoccupations change.
Do you think we'd be having as vigorous a debate as we're having in this city about Bristol's role in the Atlantic slave trade if it were not for the catalyst, to use Vanessa's word, of Colston, his name on buildings and institutions and that statue?
Well, I agree with Vanessa about the importance of social media. I think I disagree about the composition or the progressiveness of Bristol as a city, because in the center of Bristol you have this fantastic buzz, and I've lived here 45 years despite the accent, and I've seen a huge shift. But what we don't hear is all the people who moved out to Almondsbury or Chew Magna, or the sort of white donut of people who won't say anything but feel very strongly that they have a particular take on history. Now, I think they've been sold a kind of ersatz bill of goods when it comes to the kind of history that they've been taught about Bristol, but nevertheless, they feel very deeply felt attachments to the name of Colston, and we ignore that at our peril, because just driving it underground in the name of feeling, well, I hate the right-wing term virtue parading, but there is a sense of, oh, you're a racist, I'm not going to talk to you. And I think we really have to engage beyond our silos and actually get to grips with what's motivating people.
While we're on this issue, and we inevitably we're going to bump into this issue of Bristol and Colston. When you arrived in Bristol, Madge, and as an historian, and were you surprised by the lack of awareness, the lack of engagement with that part of the city's history?
Very much so. I came from California, the civil rights movement, Angela Davis and all that. It was also, I was quite engaged in Jewish history. I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, a lot of post-Holocaust survivors. When I came here after a year in London, I found it incredibly provincial. You couldn't get a green pepper. And I kept going to London every weekend. But the point was is that no one wanted to talk about it, and I thought it was quite interesting. And it just felt like the Holocaust gold thing, where no one in Austria wanted to talk about where all the money went. You just have this feeling of suppression in certain quarters, not all quarters, because there was a nonconformist tradition that wanted to engage. But the thing that really struck me in Bristol in 1970 is that a lot of white people use the term darky, which I hadn't heard since Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, with unself-conscious abandon. And I thought, my God, what's going on here? And I got really interested in that mindset. I wanted to understand it.
And as somebody who's lived most of their life in Bristol, have you seen, Vanessa, a change, a sort of a willingness to confront this history, or at least acknowledge this history?
I'm feeling increasingly aware of the bubble that I'm in. I think we're all in bubbles of various thicknesses, but I think mine is probably as thick as they get. Just because, one hangs out with people that share your own views. That's a very natural human thing to do. But I also try and actively avoid people who don't, because it's painful and uncomfortable, and actually serves to directly antagonize my livelihood and my freedom. But it does mean that, I'm maybe not aware of how the conversations that I'm used to having, that I like to feel are prevalent or emerging, may not be on a wider scale. And that's a very important and quite sobering point. So
I mean, to talk about bubbles, I mean, the Bristol Evening Post readership is probably something of a bubble, even if albeit a larger one. Were you surprised when the majority of people in the polls that they conducted were opposed to the name change of Colston Hall?
No, I'm not, because I think, regardless of where one puts oneself on the spectrum of left, right, progressive, conservative, whatever, I think change is always a difficult thing. Just out of pure laziness of I have to get my head around a different name. That sounds really silly and perfunctory, but I think there's always a sort of knee-jerk reaction of why are why are we changing a thing?
Well, I'm still struggling with Snickers. I mean, all these Americans, it's been a while, but I'm not doing well.
Stuff like that. I think we can't ignore that point, which is not a particularly profound one, but I think it's there. And yes, also that speaks to the fact that not everybody is a Bristol Uni graduate, lefty hippie like me, and I think it's definitely again another call to get out of my bubble and out of my echo chamber, and realise that there are some differing opinions and that they may not always be grounded in ignorance.
But the thing we heard over and over again in this debate, and Tim brought it up earlier, was the claim that to remove memorials or to change names is to rewrite history. Is that really the case? Or is that a sustainable point of view?
I mean, I think if you look back at European history over the 20th century, every political system has been involved in rewriting history. And much of that has been about airbrushing out certain elements or kind of offering a particular take. So, I think history is always political and memory is always political, and that a part of the politics of any history and memory is an act of rewriting and erasure. I think there is a sense in which that happens. And I guess for me, the kind of challenge is, well, what do you do about that? So let me give an example. So one of the most striking things about the way that the Holocaust is remembered in Germany is the way that East and West Germany remember it so differently in the periods when it's a split nation. So one of the big challenges that you have is, what do you do in 1989 with East German memory of the Holocaust in a camp? So you go to a place like, say, Buchenwald, and you've got a narrative there, which is a narrative which tells a story of the imprisonment of German communists. So now there's a big challenge, isn't there, in 89, is well, do you just say, actually, that's the wrong narrative? Or do you do something else with that? In part, it's kind of, there's some truth in that. There was the imprisonment of German communists within the concentration camp system, but there's a sense in which that story was overstated by the communist regime for particular reasons. Totally foregrounded. Yeah. I think what I really like about what
there's a risk of West Germans coming in and saying, actually, this story is about the Jewish minority.
And what I think is very interesting is what they decided to do there was to, and maybe you say this messes too much with the visitors' heads, but I think what they decided to do was to leave it as it was, and then to offer an alternative narrative and invite people to think about, why was this story told? And so one of the things that I think you can do is to do more sophisticated work, I think, or more nuanced work, which says that for a certain period, this hall was called this, and for another period, it's called that, and in a sense, to invite people into that conversation, or to have a statue, which was put up in the 19th century, in the centre of a city, and then to have a contextualisation of why a statue was put up in the 19th century to a particular individual, and to have a statue right next to it which says something totally different. So I think some of the work that's been done post-89 I think is very interesting in terms of the more sophisticated work was not just let's get rid of all of these narratives from the Soviet period. Actually, let's insert narratives next to them which invite people to think about the fact that the past is always contested and the past always has a politics, or memory always has a politics. So that's some of the solutions where I think we could maybe learn something from what happened in Eastern Europe after 1989.
Yeah, but I agree with you, but I felt for the mayor of Charlottesville, because what he wanted to do with the Emancipation Square, the Robert E. Lee Square, which they renamed the Emancipation Square, and then replaque the Robert E. Lee statue, which, by the way, was put up in 1917, way after Robert E. Lee died, just as Jim Crow was being, institutionalized in the States. But what he wanted to do was rebrand it. But what do you do when it becomes a place of homage for extreme right-wing violent? That's the dilemma. I don't think we're there in Bristol yet, and so maybe we should I think we should intervene in the way that you suggest. But nevertheless, it can be politically explosive not to remove statues sometimes. But then what do? You're driving it underground?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things. There's a really interesting statue in the late 80s in Hamburg, suburbs of Hamburg, where they create a large statue which is a lead covered column which gradually sinks into the ground, but individuals are invited to scribble on it. So it's kind of a statue that invites graffiti. And what's really interesting about this statue is that neo-Nazi graffiti starts to appear on this statue. So it's a statue to the murdered European Jews, which is suddenly attracting neo-Nazi graffiti, and they have this immediate moment of thinking, oh my gosh, what do we do about that? Because they're hoping that everyone will write nice things on there, you know, saying we're really sorry that the Jews from our city are dead, and actually suddenly you get all this neo-Nazi kind of nonsense being written on there. And I think one of the things that was interesting about that statue was that they felt actually it was an unearthing of the fact that Germany wasn't yet a changed nation, and for them it was this really positive space in some ways, that the statue became a place where actually the sense of this past not being lost and the presence of racism within contemporary German society was suddenly surfaced, and the statue became that point of debate, or that place where actually you could have those kinds of conversations, painful conversations, or I mean, I think it was a really painful realization that neo-Nazism was alive and well in the late 1980s in West Germany, but the statue kind of became that point of that conversation, or the reality of that being unearthed, and a way of trying to think about how to deal with that.
It'd be interesting to know what it's like now, because I was reminded as you were talking about that of Gary Young, who came, the journalist who came to Watershed for the Festival of Ideas, and he just sort of said, we have to have these face-to-face difficult conversations in the public arena. It's just so necessary, but I wonder what the state of conversation is at that statue, or has it sunk now?
Yeah, it's sunk. So, I mean, that's what's interesting about the statue, is the artist imagined it as a disappearing statue, which was a sense that there was a statue here for a particular moment in time, which was a kind of a moment of debate within a city. I quite like the idea of disappearing statues. And it was also about the disappearance of Jews. So it was also a statue which was very much about void, about the sense that the very heart of that city had been ripped out, you know, during the Holocaust.
You use the word contextualization, which is a word that always has to be part of these conversations. There is, Vanessa, people suggest a third way between leaving statues as they are, toppling them, and that the third way is some form of contextualization. When you think about Bristol, the statue to Edward Colston, do you think there is a way of rebranding it or reframing it or recontextualizing it?
Well, we were talking about Plaques over there in the sort of green room area, and I don't know how anyone else feels, but they're quite dry. They're quite uninspiring in terms of how they invite us to engage with the more nuanced ideas around our history. I'm sure there are all manner of plaques that have been put up in Bristol and in many other cities with the best of intentions that are very informative, but who reads them really? I mean, I might occasionally because I enjoy these things, but you know, they're often quite small, sort of up there. You see a date, you squint at it, you move on. It's not a particularly immediate or exciting or compelling way to bring up these things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to these memorials and statues. So I'm going to expose my bias here, and I think it's about stories, and I think it's about art, and I think it's about creating things that move, that speak, that come to us, that are working through us. So whether that be events, whether that be plays, whether that be music, whatever it might be. So events at Colston Hall that open up this conversation, not just a plaque on the wall or in the corner that explains the nuanced history behind the name and why it's changed.
But to take that example of Colston, the statue put up in the 19th century, 140 years after he died, it contains quite a strong claim. It calls him the most wise and virtuous son of the city. That is a very specific claim. That is,
no, it's trash.
Let's say
it's trash.
I was going to say contestable. We'll go with trash.
Yeah.
But is a case as strong as that, where a claim has been made for the personal moral virtue of a slave trader? Is that not a specific case where there needs to be a conversation in metal almost with another?
Don't get rid of that statement. It's so important and powerful that we remember that this is how we have considered him, or how we have labelled him up until this point, right? And we need to remember how disturbing that feeling is, that collective shudder that ran through us when we heard that sentence. We need to remember that, right? That's what I think. And I think the best way to interrupt that is to, I mean, we're getting into civil disobedience here, but yeah, I like the idea that people are defacing things and putting graffiti on things, and that we're having a very physical conversation and discussion, debate on these landmarks. I don't really want to be the one that you say incited you if you get in trouble for defacing a statue. Not me, wasn't me. But you know, I think that's really powerful. Even just silly things, like I was just thinking about how statues every now and then, you know, you'll be walking along and you'll see a statue with a traffic cone on its head, because some drunken fresher managed to get it up there. Kudos. And as silly and puerile as that may seem, I think it's as much about undermining the pomposity of it and the grandiose sort of, oh, look at this person who's been put 10 feet tall in some concrete for all time. How ridiculous is that? It's just a person, usually some dead white dude. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's about interrupting that in creative ways. Slash potentially illegal ways, but you know, I'm not the one who told you that.
I wrote an article in The Guardian in which began with me admitting that as a teenager in Newcastle, we used to put traffic cones on the statues. We used to put cigarettes in their mouths, and thought it was a funny article. And then thought, am I going to get phoned by the Northumbrian about this? So.
Alan Rice calls that guerilla memorialization. Which
Guerilla
I really like
memorialization.
And I think that's great, but I also...
well, I almost fell off once. It was almost disastrous. Is there anywhere that's taken these issues that are troubling us here in Bristol and in the southern cities of the United States that's getting it right, that's being really imaginative? I mean, thinking of extremes in Delhi, the statues of the viceroys and the great British figures of the Raj were all removed, and they're up on the Durbar plain where the great Durbars were held, and no one goes there. There's wasteland and weeds, little boys playing cricket, and these statues to Queen Victoria, and they're jumbled together.
That's amazing.
And they're in exile, and they look slightly confused,
a bit
like
they
they don't know what's
in,
happening.
Moscow, where you got Stalin and all that.
So there are ways of not destroying statues. I think Germany has this problem, which is that take the Siegel Alley statues, the statues that the Kaiser put up at the beginning of the 20th century. They were buried after the Second World War. They were never destroyed, because if you're complaining about Nazism, destroying works of art isn't the best way of opposing and showing your difference to the Third Reich. But there are lots of solutions being tried. Is there anywhere that strikes you, Tim, as being particularly creative beyond the examples you've already given?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably two examples which I think are really interesting. One is, so many people may have seen the statue in Berlin that's ultimately created, you know, a series of almost gravestones, tombstones throughout the centre of the city. There's an international competition to create a statue in Berlin, and what I think is so striking is how radical and interesting some of these solutions suggested by artists are. One is to pave 1 kilometre of the German Autobahn in cobblestones, so that you're driving your Audi along and you have to slow down to a memorial to the murdered Jews, so that for 1 kilometre you are forced to feel something. And you're forced to experience something. And so some artists said, actually, the last thing you need to do is set up some kind of pious statue. You need to have something that's a much more intrusive insertion into the experience of Germans. Another artist suggested a series of buses that would go around Berlin, which would have the names of the death camps on them. And so there'd be a bus that would run down the city street, which would say Auschwitz-Birkenau. If you got on the bus, it would actually take you to Auschwitz-Birkenau. You know, like 8 hours later, you'd be there. But there'd be this visible reminder of the sense of kind of centre periphery. And so I think, you know, one of the things we might think about is, I've always thought it'd be interesting to think about the places that receive compensation for slavery, which is the material architecture of the city, to have a big old sign which points to the place which they're connected to. You know, the sense of bringing centre and periphery together is certainly something. So there's a sense in which some of those ideas were much more about something jolting or some kind of insertion of the centre and periphery. I think the other thing in terms of guerrilla memorialisation that's really interesting in contemporary Budapest is the Hungarian state put up a memorial recently which is very much about victimisation under Nazi rule of all Hungarians, which really downplays the experience of Jews and suggests that all Hungarians were victims as opposed to some Hungarians being collaborators. What's really striking is that the memorial is here, and what a bunch of Jewish survivors and their families have done is created their own memorial here, which is to bring objects and to create a kind of counter-memorial. And so when you go to that square, you see the official story, and then you see an unofficial story. And they thought about pushing it away, but as soon as they cleared stuff away, people just brought more stuff. And so there is a sense, I think, in some places where you actually have that sense of guerrilla memorialisation being a sense of other voices being heard. And I think, to me, that's a really inspiring example. I guess the third thing is, I think the fourth plinth, Trafalgar Square, is a really interesting idea, which is actually where you curate, in some ways, something that does, it's not about pomposity, is it? The fourth plinth, in some ways, is a kind of critical intervention. I think a plinth next to old Colston, which is curated, would be a really interesting space within the city, which actually says, here's something going on which is a counter, but it's a kind of ever-changing. I think one of the dangers sometimes is memorials can be about closure, like we've done a memorial, that's over, so let's have a slavery memorial in Bristol, we're finished now, we can get on with life. I think actually something which continues conversation and discussion and debate is probably more productive.
I begin to feeling my traffic cones weren't as sophisticated as I imagined they were back in the 90s. Is there something about statues? I mean, they're a form that comes from the ancient world. That if they had a heyday in this country, it was in the 19th century. There is a phrase, the heroic statue. We tend, when we do memorials these days, to not make them figurative. Is one of the problems of statues is they invite our content for the reasons Vanessa said, is that they are pompous. Is there a problem with the form as well as the subject, Madge?
Well, I just am called to mind by the Guilt of Cain Memorial, which is in London, which is to slavery and sugar and all that sort of thing. And call me old-fashioned, and I get the point that these statues are, they're predicated on a model of history, which is the great man model of history, rather than structural forces. And I love some of the ideas that Tim was telling us about. But on the other hand, there's something about representative art that does speak to a wider audience. And if you're very abstract, you can lose a lot of people. And my sort of vision, which is, I like the idea of the plinth. I hadn't thought about a fourth plinth type of thing in Bristol. But I think we should have a memorial which answers some of the apprehensions of white traditional Bristolians who said things like, we were wage slaves, no one ever talked about us. Well, wage slavery did result in people's death and the freedom to starve, but it was a different order than being, classed as a chattel. And in terms of, numbers, et cetera, it needs to be contextualized. There were people, street children, spirited from Bristol, and convicts and people transported, Irish political prisoners to the West Indies. Well, I think they should be represented in this, thanks to the labor of enslaved Africans, but proportionately, so that people realize how much greater the contribution of enslaved Africans was to the city's prosperity. And what slavery was about. So somehow I think you have to kind of anticipate and answer those questions in a figurative and accessible way. And so that's one thing. The thing about guerrilla memorialization, which I'm all for, I think that's great, but it's quite ephemeral, and people go to a play and then they don't go, and maybe somehow with digital media we could do something that is more embedded and ever-changing at the site of the statue that engages young people. But there's a new well, there's been two interventions that really did tickle me. One was, there was a slave shackle that somebody put around the neck of Colston, which was pointed out to me when I was taking the students around, and I thought, that wasn't there originally. You begin to doubt your own sanity. It's like reading a student exam where they said, the French Revolution was in 1290. And you think, but someone had artfully put that round. Now, no one's, unless you knew about it, you weren't going to notice, but I thought that was quite witty. And Banksy evidently painted little drops of blood at one point on Colston's statue, which I thought, again, was quite a nice intervention. But now there's this beautiful plaque that an artist has done on the statue next to the wise and virtuous thing. But it's so annoying because it's a beautiful plaque, and in some ways it's really good, but because he's an artist and not a historian, he kind of gets his statistics wrong. So he's got this kind of thing where it's, Bristol centered the slave trade, 1730 to 1750 or something, which is pretty accurate. But then it says 12 million enslaved, which kind of implies Bristol was enslaving 12. Well, that was through the whole period, and it's good that people know 12 million people were transported enslaved, okay? But it's kind of misleading. And then they have 6 million died in slavery. Now, where did they get the 6 million? What does that mean? And is it kind of an immoral, trying to recast the sort of a moral equivalency about Holocaust and slavery in a kind of reparations debate? But it seems a meaningless and misleading statistic. So I wish that artists and historians would talk to each other a bit more. But I thought, visually, I did think that people might read that. At least most people don't realize 12 million people were transported between 1450 and 1880s across the Atlantic.
We've got a little bit of time, about 15 minutes for questions. There's roaming mics, I'm told, or maybe not. I hope your voice is stronger than mine, and you'll be able to make yourself hear.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank you, I think, for having a nuanced conversation that I'm about to kind of push to one side slightly. I think it's a reframing that I'm seeking to do. And I think it's interesting talking about statues, but really, we're also talking about a city response, which necessarily involves people's interaction with the city. And I'm coming back to a lot of the things that Vanessa said and the sort of things that Madge said. And for me, the issue around the statues and the naming is about hurt, not guilt. Yeah, there's a lot of pain, and it humiliates me, and I mean that quite viscerally, every time that this conversation is pushed down, and what I would say are the kind of voices that we've been hearing our whole lives become prevalent once more. And what I always say is I want to hear from the people that we're not hearing from. And we're all in an echo chamber right here, in the watershed, on the harbour side. Really look at the demographic of who's sitting in this room and speak to the fact that fundamentally we know that there are people in the city, lots of them, that are not here and will never be here potentially. And I think that has to be recognised. What happens when we create these spaces or we have roads with certain names? What happens to those people and their feelings of hurt and humiliation that necessarily remove their desire to be in certain parts of the city? I think that's very concerning for me. And it's around alienation and it's around inclusion, and it becomes a very human thing. And what we don't often do, and I think in terms of these kinds of conversations, it's not really helpful, but in a way that hasn't been raised, I feel like I need to say that for me personally, it's humiliating. That's the word. And if other people are not humiliated by this issue, I think they should sit down. And I don't want to hear from them right now. I want to hear from people that really are hurt so that their hurt can be heard.
It's not the traditional form, but can I throw something back to you, which is that there are some of the people that Madge described, who would say that they feel hurt by the idea that the history that they were brought up with is being challenged and rejected, and that they would argue that their feelings are of equal weight to your own, and that their hurt, I don't think they'd say humiliation, but they feel hurt that this history that they feel is their history.
Very simply, I would say, because it is the question that I struggle with also, because my work is around inclusion, and that necessarily includes every white man that is killing himself in this really, really strange and interesting way that we're also not discussing very widely. So I recognise there's something else there. But for me personally, at this point, the simple fact is that those voices have been heard. Their hurt has been given a priority for a long time. And my surname is Ash Harper. My mother is from West Africa, and my father is from Caribbean. There is no way that was our name. And I live with that daily. And those things are not heard. Nobody cares. Nobody really delves deeply into that struggle that I went through, going through private school as a black child in England in the 80s. I can't tell those stories. So when something like this occurs, where it's completely obvious that there's something wrong here, that slavery is not something to be celebrated, I think that it's my time, I think it's our time, and I think that we should be heard over and above for the moment. Once the skew has been dealt with, like feminism, I'm an existentialist, I'm not feminist, but once feminism has had the voice it needs, then I can go back to thinking about everybody else. That's the way I feel. Can't speak for everybody.
But well, I get what you're saying, and my son, who had a sort of consultancy job, and they trained him that when you talk to people, my toothache matters more to me than your cancer. Okay, it calls to mind, this idea that the hurt and humiliation that many white people don't get, they just don't take on. Okay. But I think that they've been sold a phony bill of goods about the Colston statue, which was, nobody wanted to pay for it in 1895. It was a way to rally people around by the liberal and conservative elite in the face of organized labor and so that you have something to rally around that's not class-based. And if people knew more about that, I think they would have a different take on the statue. On the other hand, if we have a whole Brexit constituency who are often, they haven't been, a lot of them have been marginalized class-wise. They face unemployment. They face a pretty bleak future, and they need to feel that they're listened to, because if they aren't, it's going to come up and bite us in the bum in terms of alt-right and a further divided city. And I absolutely get your point, but I think we can't just suppress that. We have to engage in a conversation, which sounds so mealy-mouthed, because what do? Refurbish the history curriculum? We've got a whole generation who know nothing about history. And I throw that out. I'm just saying that it's politically really important that we somehow refashion the city in a way that includes people.
I'm going to make one really quick, concise point. Keep it concise. I know.
Yeah, I know.
And I know that you know that I know.
This could get deep.
No, I don't even need to expand further on that. It's, those conversations need to be had, but not necessarily with us in the room. I suppose is the point.
Yeah.
Everybody needs their space, and everybody has pain, and we're also complex and conflicted. But we don't necessarily need to be in those rooms, and we don't always need to be extending all of this compassion and all of this, I understand, which is so often not reciprocated, which is why we get tired and we get impatient, and then we go, fuck it, actually, handle your shit. So yeah, that's my point.
Another question, because we've probably got time for about 3 questions if we keep them concise. There's one at the back there.
I'm very much encouraged by the theme coming out. It seems quite clear that whatever the architectural or the aesthetic, artistic response, I'm talking about statues, so I'm trying to fancy the adjective, whatever response we construct in monuments has to be open and dialogical rather than, as Tim said, a closure. Because whether that closure is an expression of state power, patriarchal power, bourgeois power, or even revolutionary justice, it's still a closure. So it has to be dialogical. But for me, in terms of the question, how should cities deal with legacies of guilt, I think what this young woman down there is articulating is that we need to be focused on the processes of healing. And I'm mindful of Thomas Hugel's work in Germany that brings together in week-long processes both perpetrators and victims of Holocaust that go through and this work's been done in many other countries and situations of conflict that go through just the profound healing that needs to and can happen, and I think that these are the processes so that the monuments can open up. But then we need to consciously and mindfully construct and facilitate processes that all of this humiliation, all this hurt, people can come together and articulate and go through the process of healing.
Can you envisage processes like this described happening in Bristol, and what would the role of the monuments and the statue of Colston, for example, be in that process?
I mean, I think the big challenge, I think, is distance over time. So, I mean, I think the thing in the Holocaust is that there's that much greater, because of the proximity of the event, there's a much clearer sense of a second and third generation. I'm trying to think how many generations we're looking at now within the British context. The number of generations, the remove is so much more distant that I think that I think is one of the challenges, so that the relationship with slavery is a much more, it's a more distant relationship than it is vis-a-vis the Holocaust.
But is that really the case in terms of the legacy of underdevelopment, psychological dislocation, and racism?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are, those there are kind of more structural as opposed to personal relationships on there. I think one of the things in the Holocaust is that there was this very much personal relationship, which was, what did my father do during the war? And that was the question asked, especially by the 68 generation in Germany. And then, what did my grandfather do? That there's that sense of that kind of personal, visceral sense of my direct relatives. Whereas I think here we have this story that's a much more dispersed story of structural. And I think those structural stuff is harder always, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the reasons why the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project that showed who got compensation in 1838 was enormously powerful, because it actually did
It personalised
telescope
it.
down
No, absolutely.
the
To family names.
centuries,
That's
and,
right.
and you had an equivalent moment.
Yeah.
I made a series about that, and 1/3 people put their name in a database to see whether their family name came up as having received compensation at the end of slavery. It's a very, very powerful thing. We've got time for one more question.
Just one real
Oh, no, hold on.
We've only got time for one more
2 minutes.
question.
There's one question here,
No,
please.
no.
This lady here. Thank you very much.
I just want to pick up on the point that was just made. My ancestors actually owned slaves in the Caribbean. I live in Easton. One day there was a knock on the door. I opened the door. There was a black woman there. She had a name tag on, and my ancestors had enslaved her ancestors. And in fact, one of her family members was still living on that estate in Barbados. So actually, it's very easy to think it all happened, many generations ago, but it is still really pertinent for lots of people living in the city today, and we mustn't forget that, I think, on both sides.
How have we forgotten that, though? Because it does seem to have been forgotten, Madge.
Well, I think family history is really the way forward to make these connections, and I think we need a partnership between academic and family historians and the slave ownership database, et cetera, to make these connections. And Adrian Stone has done a lot of good work with his own journey. He's from St. Paul's, and he traced his family back to an Igbo woman, in Jamaica. So I think we need to do this, but it's also that's all a part of that process and part of that a wider thing, and it's very difficult to reconcile that with the more immediate thing about what do we do about the statue. And I don't have any ready-made answers here, but I'm throwing that back. And I think we should make a distinction, by the way, between buildings and statues, or street names and statues. But people grew up under the Colston statue and had their first kiss or got drunk there or what have you, and they have associations which, if they're not, if they don't know anything about their history, they don't feel that hurt and that humiliation. And I think that's what we need to work on.
Thank you very much. We've just about come to the end of our time. I'm sorry for those of you who had questions and didn't get to answer them. Thank you very much for coming. If I can inform you, Waterstones are running a bookstall, and they have the books of our panellists for sale just outside in the corridor. There's consultation cards as well. Please, if you get a chance, do fill them in. Tell the organisers of the Festival Ideas what you think of today's event, what other events you might like to see, who you'd like us to invite to our city to share their ideas and their work. And thank you for supporting the Bristol Festival of Ideas. Thank you for coming to another event early in the morning. It's much easier to come to events in the evening, especially maybe after a drink in the bar. I'm so pleased and flattered that so many of you want to come and hear this panel discuss these issues on a morning. Thank you very much. A round of applause to our panelists, please. Madge Dresser, Vanessa, Kisuule, and Tim.
Can I just invite you to look up journeytojustice.org.uk. We've had 43 events in Bristol. We've got 20 more to go till the end of the month. Please have a look.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Great. Pleasure.
Thank you.
It's really